Thanks for watching, all you YouTubers out there. This is episode number 59. This is all about Hawaii stuff. I've got a great guest today, and I hope you learned something. Thanks for watching. Okay, here we go. Well, hello there. Thanks for joining me. I am Dr. Jen. Today's show is all about the confusion of the Hawaii Landlord-Tenant Code, especially when you throw in the recent wildfires. I am joined by an amazing local expert, Legal Aid Society of Hawaii's managing attorney of Housing and Consumer Unit. Welcome, Nick Severson. Thanks, Nick, for joining me today.
Thanks for having me. Happy to be here.
Excellent. That's quite the title, Legal Aid Society of Hawaii's managing of. So tell me, what is the Legal Aid Society of Hawaii all about? What is that all about?
Yeah, sure. So the Legal Aid Society of Hawaii is the state's oldest and largest nonprofit law firm. So we have about 100 employees in total across each of the islands throughout the state. So we even have offices on Lanai and Molokai as well. So we serve primarily low-income folks throughout the state with a variety of legal issues ranging from family law, obviously housing, consumer-related issues, immigration issues, public benefits, a whole host of things. So that's what we're about.
Now, you had told me when you and I talked originally that you were actually had some ties to Maui, and now it's changed a little bit for you. What was your ties to Maui?
Yeah, so my wife actually has family on Maui. So I actually began my legal career on Maui. I practiced there for about 2.5 years as a staff attorney for the Legal Aid Society of Hawaii prior to moving over to Oahu to do my current role. And I've actually been back and forth weekly to Maui since September as we've experienced a bit of transition in our office. So I've been filling in for the managing attorney position on Maui, as well as we've sought a replacement for that position. So lots of good ties to Maui. I have a very soft spot in my heart for the folks there, and I've been glad to be able to come back and forth and serve over the last few months.
And since September, that's right in the heart of responding to the wildfires. You've seen it just the same as me about these wildfire housing, all kinds of proclamations from both the mayor, County of Maui mayor, and the governor. What do you see as the impacts of those proclamations from where you sit?
Yeah, so obviously the proclamations have had a pretty significant impact on the rental market throughout the island of Maui, right? So just for the listeners to kind of clarify what the parameters of the proclamations are, right? So the governor is now on, I believe, the eighth proclamation. I'd have to double check that. But specifically relating to housing, as it relates to rental housing, basically, it curtails a landlord's ability to terminate rental agreements for a variety of reasons. And the policy reason behind that is probably relatively obvious, right? You have an already tight housing market on Maui, and then you have both a large number of recently displaced folks, right? And then you also have sort of the other impacts that folks on Maui are feeling from the fire, right? So people that have either lost employment or had, their hours cut, for example, might be having difficulty paying the rent, things of that nature, right? So really what the proclamation aims to do is keep people kind of status quo, right? So currently the proclamation, which is now in effect through March 5th, after the latest extension, basically prohibits the following, right? So terminations of rental agreements for non-payment of rent, right? So if anyone is currently delinquent on their rent, a landlord cannot currently pursue that action, at least as long as the proclamation is currently in effect. A landlord can also not raise rents on an existing rental agreement, right? So typically in the state of Hawaii, you can increase the rent with a particular notice that lets the tenant know, hey, I'm going to increase your rent. Once that period of time lapses, the landlord can increase the rent. That's currently prohibited as well. And then the emergency proclamation also invokes a particular section of the Hawaii revised statutes that also curtails a landlord's ability to terminate month-to-month tenancies. So it's very similar, and the proclamations in large part mirror some of the proclamation language that was in place during the early stages of the COVID-19 pandemic. But essentially the limitation on landlords is that if you have a month-to-month tenant, the lease can't be terminated unless the property is sold to a bona fide purchaser or an owner or immediate family member of the owner intends to move into the property. So these protections have obviously, really limited the landlord's ability to terminate a rental agreement, essentially just to conduct-related reasons, right? So if a tenant is unruly or engaging in some type of conduct that's, contrary to what the lease requires, those type of cases can still move forward. Similar to termination of fixed term leases, right? So if a lease by its terms was set to expire on a certain date, that can still be, a valid grounds for termination of a lease. But for non-payment cases and for month-to-month cases specifically, relatively limited in terms of a landlord's ability to terminate a lease on Maui currently.
Oh my goodness. And Nick, I work with a lot of different landlording, I don't even know what the right word is, landlording worlds, not just in Hawaii, but all across the US and Canada as a part of this podcast. I do lots and lots of research, but I'm a landlord on Maui and I'm a landlord in British Columbia as well. And my head is spinning just from what you said, which is amazing. So the fact that you have it under control, even with me, living in this world too, I had no idea that there was a difference between the month to month ending. You can't end a month to month tenancy under this proclamation. I guess the question everybody's asking is, do we have any idea when these proclamations are going to change or end? Maybe not right now.
Frankly, not really, no. And I mean, under the law, the proclamations are in effect for 60 days, right? So the governor just made this latest proclamation on January 5th, right? So last Friday, that takes us through March 5th. What the governor's done, with these proclamations and the series of proclamations that have come out post Maui fires, the governor's handled them pretty similarly to how the previous governor handled the proclamations during the early stages of COVID, which is essentially right up until that last day, right? March 4th or March 5th in this case is when we learn whether the proclamation is extended or not, right? And there's always kind of the tea leaf reading, and you have folks that may or may not be in the know that might have some sense of what's coming, but frankly, we never really know for sure until kind of right up until that date. And then once they're extended, the governor usually uses the full power of those 60 days, right? So in the event that the governor is going to extend some of these protections, and certainly could extend some, but not all, maybe all, who can say, would likely do so for the entire period for another 60 days, and then we'd kind of be in that same cycle, until another proclamation was added, or the governor decided ultimately to no longer enact their emergency powers.
Okay. Well, there's lots of items going on now in the state trying to get housing to for these fire survivors that are still living in the hotels at the moment. And I'm seeing on Facebook, Nextdoor, some different advertising where there's language where it says, hoping for a fire survivor couple, or they're specifically targeting tenants that are fire survivors or different traits. They're saying we're looking for a traveling nurse, or we're looking for, a teacher or teacher's aide or something like that. And looking with the Fair Housing Act, are people allowed to advertise like that? Is that allowed at any time? Is it allowed now?
Yeah, so let me maybe give you a little setup to that
Okay.
question, just to kind of help orient the audience on this. So just so folks are aware, the Legal Aid Society of Hawaii is the only entity in the state that receives money from the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development to enforce fair housing law. So we get grants specifically from HUD to enable us to do casework and enforce the various state and federal fair housing laws, right? So that's obviously good for tenants. So if you're a tenant that's listening to this podcast and believe that you've been discriminated against, you can certainly reach out to our office.
Mhm.
If you are a landlord and would like technical assistance as to what may or may not be permissible given fair housing law,
Mhm.
we also offer technical assistance as well. So landlords that would like information about, maybe taking certain actions or not taking certain actions and whether or not that would be legally permissible, we're able to provide that as well. With the caveat that technical assistance is not legal advice, right? So we're not going to be taking cases specifically for landlords, right? We represent tenants, but we can explain the law and how it applies. So maybe in the vein of explaining what technical assistance is, I'm kind of setting myself up for this particular answer. Um, in general, such ads advertising for, say, fire, folks displaced by the fires, or, particular individuals that say maybe are teachers or teacher aides or whatever, would not be in and of themselves problematic, right? In order for there to be an issue with either state fair housing law or the Fair Housing Act, the federal law,
Mhm.
it would need to implicate a protected class, right? So each of those laws articulate specific characteristics that would need to be the basis of the discrimination, right? So race, religion, gender, sexual orientation, disability, right? And there's several more that I'm not naming. So for example, if there was an ad that said, seeking a single female tenant, now you have a problem, right? Because you're both seeking a single individual, right? So that implicates the protected class of familial status, right? You're basically saying we will not rent to families. And you're also, by saying female, you're saying that you will not rent to males. So that's a doubly problematic ad, right? That's going to run afoul of state and federal fair housing law. But those characteristics that you're mentioning, say fire survivor, someone that has a particular occupation, that would not by itself be problematic. Where someone could run into problems with that is if certain characteristics would be overly implicated by that status. So essentially, HUD puts out guidance on what's called disparate impact discrimination. Essentially, it's these facially neutral policies or certain policies that would go into place that would have a disproportionate impact on individuals of a certain protected class, right? So it's not something that ostensibly says, no women, no African Americans, no whatever, right? It's not facially discriminatory, but it has an effect on that certain protected class or that certain population. So if it happens to be that, we want traveling nurses and 90% of traveling nurses, and to be clear, I don't know this, I don't have data on traveling nurses, but 90% of traveling nurses are female, that might have the disparate impact of excluding males or largely excluding males from that housing. So long-winded way and probably overly in-depth way of saying facially it's not problematic, but landlords that are advertising in that way should give a lot of thought to how those different protected groups may be implicated in a way that could be problematic.
Gotcha. Yeah, there's so much technical stuff going on, and with the Fair Housing Act, and now of course with these proclamations, there's a lot of technical wording in all of this, and so it's really important we get it right. So I'm so thankful that you're on my show today. And I got another thing to ask you about, something that I saw about a month ago called a reverse eviction. A reverse eviction. This is where the landlord gives proper notice to a tenancy that is ending. Now, obviously, month-to-month tenants, they're not going to get ended because the emergency proclamation extends them now. So let's say it's a fixed term that's ending, and there's been discussion of renewal, but that landlord then will increase the rent basically to what they think is market rent and is much, much higher than what they're paying, which the tenant then cannot afford the new rent, and then the tenant has no choice but to leave. Have you heard of this reverse eviction? Like, is this a problem in the world right now with Hawaii and all of the different things going on? Have you heard of this?
Yeah, and I'll take it outside of the context of Maui a little bit, just because
Okay,
obviously the proclamation kind of makes this a little bit more of a challenging conversation. But
sure.
in general across the state, the cost of housing is very high, right? I mean, I think we can all agree that that's just kind of the way it is throughout the state, right?
Yeah.
What ends up happening is a lot of people are already pretty, especially folks that are working in, say, the service industry, working at hotels, working at restaurants, working at bars throughout the state, and maybe making relatively limited income, maybe living with other family members and kind of cobbling together, 3, 4, 5 different jobs collectively to try to pay the rent. where the rent is already kind of at a tipping point for folks, right? It's already at a very high level, right? Basically all they can afford. And it may be for very legitimate reasons that the landlord needs to raise the rent, right? The HOA fees are going up. There's other, things that are changing about the landlord's circumstances that would require them to raise the rent. And they're doing so in a legally permissible way. But it does have the effect of effectively, limiting that person's ability to live there, right? Maybe they could afford the rent at 2,400, but at 3,000, that's a bridge too far, right? They can't do it anymore, right? The reality is there's just not enough housing in the state of Hawaii for the people that live here, right?
Right.
And this problem sort of snowballs with this problem that you're describing, where now we have this tenant who is sort of in between a rock and a hard place, right? On the one hand, they know they can't pay the new rent, right? And maybe they have a good long relationship with their landlord, and just they want to do right by the landlord too, and they don't want to stay past whatever the date is, right, that they've been given if they can't agree to this rent increase or what have you. But there's also just not a lot of housing to find, and especially not a lot of housing to be had at a dollar amount that might make sense for folks. So that ends up displacing people both short and long term. And it's part of the reason that we have a reverse population growth in the state, right?
Yeah.
Where people are consistently leaving Hawaii because they just can't cut it here, right? Financially, it becomes prohibitive on a cost level to stay here. So it certainly happens. It's something that we see pretty regularly. And, I think, to bring it back to Maui, I think it's something that once the proclamation ends, whenever that is, it's something that we're going to see with increasing frequency there too, right? Because we're going to see not only the people that are currently housed, right? But then you're going to have folks that are trying to re-enter the rental market, right? That were displaced from the fires and trying to re-enter. So it's going to just, create an increasing squeeze on the market. And also, for some reasons legitimate and some just because there's an ability to get more for rent. You're just going to see rents go up, and that's going to have the effect of displacing folks.
Gotcha. No, thanks for that. We're talking lots about Hawaii, and I know Fair Housing Act is federal. It's across the nation, and so the next question is about the nuances of Hawaii versus other locations. Do you have any exposure to places outside Hawaii? How's Hawaii different?
Yeah, so I guess just as the caveat, I'm only licensed to practice in Hawaii, so I'll just say that there as I editorialize on other things. Um, in terms of landlord tenant law specifically, my assessment is that state law is relatively in the middle in terms of kind of the extremes that you'll see across the country, right? I think there are some states that are certainly more friendly to the landlord than the state of Hawaii is, and I think there's also some states that are more friendly to tenants than the state of Hawaii is. I think it's kind of in the middle. Where I would say that the state fair housing law is actually quite progressive compared to a lot of other states across the country. So just for a little context, so the Federal Fair Housing Act enumerates a certain number of protected classes, right? And that's sort of the baseline, right? That's what everyone across the country can expect, that they're not going to be discriminated against based on those protected classes, right? The states also have the ability to enact their own fair housing laws, right? And Hawaii has done so, right? And in those state fair housing laws, you can articulate additional protected classes, right? So Hawaii is actually relatively broad in terms of protecting other protected classes, right? So just to give a couple examples, Hanai status, right? So that's something that's unique, obviously, to Hawaii, right? So that's the idea of caring for one child or perhaps multiple children without a necessarily a legal relationship to that child, right? You didn't adopt them, you didn't have guardianship, but their legal parent has decided that it'd be best for them to be in your care, right? So you're caring for them under your roof. That's Hanai status. A denial of housing, for example, based on having a Hanai child would be discrimination. Hawaii would not be discrimination elsewhere, right?
Sure.
Sexual orientation, gender identity expression, also protected under state law. Marital status as well. And there's a couple more that I'm not springing to mind immediately, but there are additional protected classes that are implicated in state law. And some states have additional protections, right? There's other states that have protections for source of income discrimination, right? And there is a source of income discrimination law on the books in Hawaii, but it's not contained in the same provision of the law as the fair housing law is. So it's a
Okay.
little bit separate and apart. There's also some states that have protections for military veterans, for
Hmm.
example. So there's other protections that are out there, but Hawaii tends to be more protective, I would say, than most states in terms of the fair housing law.
Okay. Wow, that's amazing. I super appreciate that. Um, so let's talk about Maui compared to the other islands. Are there nuances between Maui and even pre-fires? Maybe that's even a better question. Is pre-fires, were there nuances between Maui and other islands? No?
Yeah, I mean, I would say in general, just in terms of the legal process, it plays out differently, right? I mean, obviously the landlord-tenant code is the same across the state.
Of course.
But what I will say is that, from my experience practicing, and I've had the privilege of practicing on now every island actually, is the neighbor islands tend to move things along a little bit quicker in the courts,
Hmm.
proclamations notwithstanding,
Right.
than Oahu. So things tend to take a little bit longer to go through the court process on Oahu,
Hmm.
um, which is kind of interesting. Typically, particularly with Big Islands, Kauai, and Maui, things tend to move a little bit more quickly. The other thing that I think is maybe more of a recent, I would say, addition to Maui is kind of landlord tenant practice that's been, I think, helpful to see is an increased utilization of the mediation process,
Hmm.
which I think we on Oahu have had a little bit more in place previously.
Mm-hmm.
And I think the neighbor islands are kind of seeing that and implementing that a little bit more as well, and giving both landlord and tenant a voice in that process and not just leaving it up to a judge to decide, right? And giving both sides a chance to, reach an agreement of some kind that can be something that everybody lives with, and not just be again a decision from a judge. So that's been really positive to see as well. And I guess the only other thing I would note, in general, I think just in my experience, um, in the neighbor islands, a lot more landlords tend to practice pro se, meaning representing themselves in court,
Hmm.
than hiring an attorney. The vast majority of tenants end up being unrepresented, and they represent themselves across the state. That's just true generally. But on the neighbor islands, more landlords represent themselves. And what I've noticed is that sometimes that can make the process a little bit more challenging.
Mm-hmm.
Um, because if they're not folks that have given a lot of consideration to some of the nuance that we're talking about today, for example, it can make things get a little bit jammed up in the court system, where sometimes it's a little bit helpful to have an attorney involved. Not that I'm trying to make a full-on plug for my profession here, but just sort of my observation is that tends to be the case a little bit more on the neighbor islands.
Gotcha. Wow, there's a lot to this, and I see landlords often. I'm in lots of Facebook groups of all kinds with landlording. Landlords that are brand new, landlords that are like me that I'm not brand new. I try to do my best to educate myself, and then we've got people that are in a pickle. They've made mistakes and they shouldn't have either rented, or maybe they discriminated against somebody and now there's a problem. What's the biggest mistakes that you're seeing Hawaii landlords make in this environment?
Yeah, I mean, I think the biggest mistake I'm seeing and that we see generally is just a lack of knowledge, right?
Okay.
And there's a lot to know, right? And that's, on some level, the part of the responsibility that one assumes when they are going to decide to be a landlord, right? So it's just knowing that there's good resources out there, right? So the Department of Commerce and Consumer Affairs for the state of Hawaii puts out a very helpful landlord-tenant handbook that's very helpful to review. I'm sure you've reviewed that. I'm sure you've mentioned that perhaps before on this platform. Um, it really kind of breaks down. It's nice because it doesn't just regurgitate the statute, right? And to your point earlier when we were talking about the proclamation, some of the language of some of the legal stuff gets to be a bit technical, right? So without maybe the advice of a lawyer, it can be a little bit tricky to navigate, right? So the Department of Commerce and Consumer Affairs, their landlord tenant handbook is a helpful kind of digestible, I think it's like 35 pages, relatively brief, but still comprehensive breakdown of the landlord tenant code. And then another thing I'll make a plug for is every April is Fair Housing Month. And the Legal Aid Society of Hawaii, in conjunction with HUD and the Hawaii Civil Rights Commission, which is the state agency that enforces fair housing law,
Hmm.
do a series of presentations throughout the month of April that are designed really to anyone that wants to see them, but primarily to housing providers, right?
Mhm.
To be able to learn more about fair housing and the nuance of fair housing, right? So we'll be getting the word out on that shortly in the coming months so folks can participate in that. But that's a really good way to learn about state and federal fair housing law, and a really good way to get familiar with the folks that are trafficking in that, right? So, you'll see me, you'll see my colleagues doing that, you'll see the folks from HUD and HCRC, and those are the same folks that would be providing that technical assistance I mentioned earlier, right? So I mentioned that our office does that. HUD does that as well, right? HUD can give you technical assistance as a landlord about the ins and outs of the Fair Housing Act. So that lack of knowledge can be overcome. It just requires that effort. And I think if folks make the effort and come from a good place, that can be achieved.
I've been to the fair housing, I guess days, workshops, whatever it is, I forget. Pre-COVID, I went many, many years in a row. And then of course, COVID, they had it scheduled for March of 2020 and or April 2020, it got canceled because of COVID. And I think that was before everybody got on board with Zoom. And I'm hoping that there is more. Sounds like there is more coming up in April, which is great because as much as I feel educated and I'm excited to educate others in this podcast, I'm always learning. And there's always something, a nuance of some kind that I always take away from these workshops, which is great. Yeah. So here's the next question. What happens if a tenant feels they might be getting taken advantage of by a landlord? What should they do?
They should call us.
Okay.
I mean, that's my broad answer, but I have a few more things to say too. I mean, so we represent a whole bunch of tenants throughout the state, and we can provide, a pretty good legal assessment as to what is taking place and whether or not it is in fact, discrimination or would otherwise be legally problematic, right? So folks can certainly apply online. You can see the email address behind my head here. And our phone number is 808-536-4302. The other thing I would say is just, there is a power dynamic certainly in the landlord-tenant relationship, whether, actually trying for it to be that way or it just happens naturally, right? But sometimes it's just a breakdown of communication, right?
Mm,
So one thing that we always encourage tenants to do is to just communicate in writing, right? Make sure that you're having a back and forth. Make sure that everyone's clear about what the expectations are or what the conversation was or what the issues are, right? Because so much of what we see, and maybe this goes back to the kind of common problems that we see or what have you, or common problems that we see with landlords, is the communication breaks down, right? And the landlord thinks one thing, the tenant thinks the other thing, and there's not a whole lot in the middle to kind of show whose understanding is correct, right? So just be clear, be communicative on both sides, and just make sure that there's documentation of that communication, right? Written letters, emails, text, all that's fine, but just make sure that everyone's on the same page. And a lot of those kind of misunderstandings or a lot of that gray area can get sorted out that way.
gotcha. So for those of you who are not watching my YouTube channel, legalaidhawaii.org is Nick's website. And can you say your phone number again for Legal Aid Society of Hawaii?
Yep. So it's 808-536-4302.
Perfect. Let me ask the question that everybody's thinking. Does Legal Aid Society of Hawaii cost money?
That's a good question. So no, our services do not cost. So assuming someone qualifies for our services, they would only be responsible for any court fees, right? So if there's a filing fee related to their case, something like that, the client would have to pay for that. But for the actual attorney or paralegal time that would go into assisting them, there would not be a cost for that.
Gotcha. So I'm going to bring up one other thing that I saw recently, and it's very, very recent on Facebook. It has to do with the wildfires. This is a very specific question about the wildfires, that a Maui landlord was getting a demand letter from a previous tenant where the house was lost in the fires. And I don't know if this was in Lahaina or Kula, but somewhere. And the tenant was demanding relocation fees from the landlord. And this landlord was turning to Facebook saying, I have no idea if this is a valid demand or what? What does the landlord do in the case of the fires on August 8th? Do they return partial rent? Do they have to pay relocation fees? What's the landlord responsibility in the case of these wildfires?
It's a good question. Yeah. So if the house was either, if the I shouldn't say house, could be a condo, what have you. So if the dwelling unit was either destroyed, right, by the fire or rendered uninhabitable, right, utilities no longer work because the infrastructure was destroyed, we have all kinds of cases like that, right? Then it is the landlord's obligation to return the security deposit as well as prorated rent for the month of August, right? So whatever the calculation would be from the amount of days where, post disaster, so from basically August 9th through the end of August, that amount of rent should be returned. So that is the landlord's obligation, would be to return both that prorated rent and the security deposit.
Gotcha. That's great. Nick, thank you so much for joining us today. Is there anything else that we should tackle during our discussion here? You've got all the landlord's ears here in Hawaii. What else should we say?
I'll just make one more plug.
Sure.
I know the legal process is scary on both sides of it, right? I mean, I know landlord or tenant, no one wants it to get that far, and hopefully it doesn't. But in the event that there is, again, a need for technical assistance, you want to learn more about what your rights and what your obligations are, certainly feel free to call that number I mentioned earlier, as well as, again, attending those trainings in April. We'll get the word out on those soon. They'll be on Zoom this year. They're 2-hour sessions each week of April. So we'll get that out. And then, the other thing I would just mention, I kind of mentioned this earlier too, in the context of communication, but, there's a lot of money in the state right now for mediation. And I would just say, particularly for landlords on Maui that are listening to this, given the constraints of the proclamation and everything that's currently happening, there are non-legal ways to resolve issues too, right? So that's my plug for mediation. The Maui Mediation Center, or Maui Mediation Services rather, does landlord-tenant mediations and may be able to help find solutions to some of the problems that may not currently be able to be solved by the court process. So just wanted to put in a plug for that as well.
Fantastic. Fantastic. Well, thank you so much for being with me here today, Nick. For my listeners out there, they know that we'll discuss a topic, and then I always throw in a call to action at the very end. For the Hawaii listeners, you've already done the work for them. The call to action today is, regardless of where you are located, where your rentals are, where is your fair housing nonprofit, your legal aid society, whatever the local nonprofit is that can help you with fair housing, whether it's the federal or state fair housing, wherever you're located in Canada or US, how do you get a hold of them? You need to Google that. Google whatever your state, province, or territory is, and then maybe fair housing, and figure out what that phone number is. If you've got a question, who do you actually turn to? And that's the question. In Hawaii, we know it's Nick at Legal Aid Society of Hawaii. But wherever you are, that's your call to action today. Thanks so much again to Nick Severson for joining us. Yay.
Thanks
Appreciate
again for
your
having
help.
me. Appreciate the discussion.
Excellent. For all you listeners out there, let me know your comments and questions. You can email me at learn@mylifeasalandlord.com. I know that your comments and questions create the next podcasts and resources. And if you know of a really great guest that I should have on my next podcast, please send them to mylifeasalandlord.com to a guest application. Is on the website. I'm always looking for a dynamic guest to bring value to all of you. Don't forget, the resources on the website include many ways to invest in your continuing landlord education. Check out mylifeasalandlord.com for more details. And that's our episode. Nick, thanks so much. YouTubers out there, thanks so much. Let me turn the recording off, and then we will chat a little bit more.